I'd like to call this work session orders our work session dealing with police and fire retirement system unfunded liability. Let's go around the room and identify ourselves for the record, please. Ma'am?
Cynthia Reed, K&L Gates. We're bond counsel to the municipality.
Thanks for being here.
Stephen Cantor, Hilltop Securities Financial Advisor to the municipality.
Robert Harris, CFO.
John Weddleton.
Felix Rivera.
Christopher
Good
Constant.
training.
Eric Croft.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Pete Peterson.
Okay.
Great,
Mr. Harris, we'll turn over to you, sir.
thank you. I'll just make a brief remark and then turn it over, ask Steve and Cynthia to basically talk about this. But as Bill Falsey had indicated 2 weeks ago, we have an issue with an unfunded liability with our police and fire retirement system, and we're looking at a mechanism to allow us to fund that liability, and as a result then adjust the stream of payments that we would be making from the present level of about $10 million to a smaller level per year. So with that, if I can turn over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
As you learned in the work session a couple weeks ago, there is a unfunded liability of approximately $68 million. $75 million of between the actuarial amount for the police and fire and the amount of assets currently on hand. Currently, the way the municipality is funding that unfunded liability is by depositing $10 million of cash each year from the general fund into the fund. One alternative which we're proposing is that by borrowing that money today and depositing it today, we can reduce the amount that the municipality has to pay on an annual basis, and thus overall, because the interest rate on that we would be borrowing at is less than the assumed interest rate by the pension obligation. We would propose to fund approximately 90% of the unfunded liability. That is because if we fund too much money, then the fund becomes overfunded, and there are lots of ramifications there. So we felt 90% was a good enough number to get to and also minimize the ultimate cost to the municipality. Currently, the system is being amortized at a rate of 7.7%. As you may know, there is a meeting of the system on November 8th where that assumption is going to be reviewed. Should that number be lowered, that would or changed at all, that would affect the calculation of the unfunded liability and then ultimately the amount of money that we propose to borrow. But our goal here, project, is to have 90% of the unfunded liability be represented by the issuance of certificates of participation. On page 4,
Just a moment, can I ask as we go?
Good, John.
So can you define amortized debt and interest rate?
yes, sir.
In layman's speak?
Yes, the amount, the unfunded liability is calculated based upon a number of different assumptions. It's assuming a lot of useful lives and people continuing to live and the amount of benefits that are into the system. That amount is then amortized such as your mortgage would be over a period of time, because it's assumed that we're going to be earning interest on the assets as well.
So you're saying, so if we owe $68 million, we'll pay 7.7% of that amount per year?
Yeah, essentially that's how you calculate, how you take the $68 million and spread it out over a period of time based upon that interest rate. That's correct.
Okay, but that could change next year. That could be 10 or 5. Does it change annually? Because we have a steady state 10.2.
The 10.2 million currently is based on that 7.7%. Should, for whatever reason, the system change, and part of that is a function of how much is the fund earning. We've traditionally across the country, most municipal pension funds are calculated to earn at a rate of 7 to 8%. Fact is that in the recent environment, interest rates have been lower, and it's been harder to raise that money. But if you look over a 20-year period, depending upon the nature of the assets, that's pretty much been the proxy where it is. But the fund in and of itself has the ability to change that rate by vote.
Okay.
It's not something that the municipality gets to choose.
We have a new reality. So this 20-year view, do you still use that? I thought people gave up on that.
It's still the state of the art in terms of how you calculate what these, you're looking at a long-term rate of investment, a long-term rate of performance. Performance goes up and down. Changing the rate each year would cause dramatic impact in terms of how much you're depositing. So while we're trying to make a steady state of 10.3, because of our purposes, if you raise it up or raise it down, that could cause havoc in terms of your budget. So that's why we use a longer term approach.
Eric?
The fundamental assumption of this proposal is that we can earn more, we can borrow and earn more by putting it in than we have to pay in borrowing. Right? The cost, it's sort of following on John's question, that the cost of borrowing is so low, and we presume a rate we can get it by putting it in, that we're gonna beat that. But I mean, or at least my take on John's question is, what if those historic 7 to 8% rates we can't achieve anymore because either of the low interest rate environment we're in or other factors? Haven't we bet $68 million on our ability to beat 3% essentially?
No, and here's why. Once you put the money into the fund's going to be better off than if you didn't put the money in the fund. So yes, we're certainly calculating this, that the amount of assets that we're going to put into the fund will exceed the cost of borrowing, but the fund's always better off unless you earn negative money on the return.
Which happens.
From time to time it does. But we're looking at over the next 15 years when the fund needs to be funded, that we expect that with the fund management and prudent investment policies that the fund has been operating under.
I'll let this move on. What is that prudent investment policy? That is, how much is stock in our current mix? Are we at 50, 60, 70 on this fund of stock?
We, that is the municipality, does not manage the fund. The system manages the fund. The system has its own investment guidelines.
What are they in?
And they're currently, I think I have it here. On page 10, this is the current asset allocation of fund. So they have both equities and fixed income, real assets.
60% equity, 40 of domestic and 20 essentially of international.
Yes, sir.
So if we put that 70 in, I know we got to move on, and the stock market tanks, we still owe the payments,
We still have to pay.
and we've lost it in the market. I mean, we can get back to a serious unfunded situation by market losses, and we still have to pay back our $68 million that we borrowed.
If the market tanks, the value of the fund goes down, regardless of whether or not you put the 68 million in. And so if the market tanks for whatever reason and we're not protected, the value of the fund and your amount's going to have to go up in terms of your contributions.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll move on.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay.
It's easier if we answer the questions. By the way, is there anybody here from the board? You're here, are you? Okay, you're the only board member. Did you know about this, what they were talking about doing?
Yes,
Okay. Have you guys taken a position on this yet?
we are discussing it. We have some guidelines, we're on 3.85. Well, we're going to have a meeting November the 8th, which as a full board discuss it. We've had a preliminary meeting due to the courtesy of Michael Abbott bringing information to us. That's
Okay.
as far as we've gotten so far.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, ma'am.
you may have some board members on the telephone or the administrator of the fund. You may have some of them on the phone.
Is anybody on the phone? Maybe they're on mute or something, Burma. Anyway, please continue, sir.
Yes, sir. So on page 4, trying to get back to the presentation, but
I know.
this is a chart of interest rates over the last 20 years. So we demonstrating why we think that this is a good time to borrow, because the interest rate cost of borrowing is not its absolute lowest, but at pretty low rates. In terms of, on page 5, we show the budgetary effects of this transaction, making a lot of assumptions in terms of amortization, which need to be reviewed by the board on November 8th. We would be able to structure this transaction so there would be no debt service and no payment at all in 2018, and then we would amortize the debt over the remaining life of the transaction. So the savings to the municipality, at least from a budgetary standpoint, would be 10.3 in year 1 And then going forward, there would be still savings, but lesser savings. On page 6, the question was, has the municipality done this before? And the answer is yes. In 1986, the municipality issued COPs, which is what we're proposing to do today, to finance the deposit to the police and fire medical trust. That was an amount of approximately $27 million. We refinanced that in 1996, and in 2006, these certificates were in fact retired. So this is something that the municipality has done before.
On that, I'd be interested in whether the 86 assumptions about, that formed the basis for the COP turned out to be, how accurate they turned out to be. Right, is what they based their assumptions in an 86 model, and did the performance.
But, I mean, the quick, I will get you the answer, Mr. Croft, but, and unfortunately, I wasn't involved in this transaction back in '86. But Cynthia was.
I was much younger.
But the answer is that, looking back just empirically on the evidence, that this was a very profitable transaction
Yeah.
for the municipality.
No, and I understand that, and remember just that it worked out very, very well. I'd be interested to say what we assumed we would get, and then I think we got a lot more than that.
We did,
Yeah.
yes. So it was
We
very,
were
worked out right.
wildly, and to our net benefit, inaccurate on our assumptions.
By definition, we're always, we try
Inaccurate.
to be conservative with that definition, so we always like to be wrong in terms of those
Okay.
assumptions. So.
We are always wrong.
Oh, yeah, we just don't know how and in what way.
Please continue,
Yeah, I
sir.
was right.
Mr. Chair.
I was here
John?
on that. But even though I was right.
So maybe I missed something, but we had paperwork and looked at this last week, going through a discussion 2 weeks ago. And somehow I didn't think we were on the hook for $10.3 million all the way through 2033. I thought we were good after 6 or 7 years. We were at 90%, we stopped. This shows,
Well, we made some assumptions, and so, and the assumptions can be altered, and we can redo the analysis, but the assumption we made was that the original 10.3 was good for 15 years, and that began 5 years ago. So we have another 10 years remaining on the 10.3. However, if, as expected, the interest rate goes down in terms of the amortization, that's going to increase the overall liability and continue, that the municipality is going to continue to have to pay additional money. So for the purposes of this analysis, we just assume that we would be amortizing the 10.3 over the whole remaining 15 years as well as the life of the bonds. As we go through these assumptions with the system, we may be altering those assumptions and figuring out, and that would alter the savings.
John, you got a question look on your face.
I'm open for, we've done
I
a number
think
of
you've
different
done,
analysis.
this makes it look like a better deal than I think it is, because we'll get to 90% funded much faster than 2033. So this adds in $62 million as if it were a benefit. I mean, it's unlikely for us to be paying this in 2028 through 33.
If everything works out correct, you're absolutely right. I mean, what we try to do is present a conservative analysis, but we can show you different analysis that we run in terms of more optimistic scenarios, which would show that, you know, the extent that you continue to earn money on the fund, you would reduce the amount of money that you can pay.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you. Over the last couple of decades, the state has made huge deposits to pay down the PERS and TERS. I don't know, $7 or $8 billion, you remember? Yeah. Probably a dumb question, but those deposits which reduce the unfunded thing, how did that affect the performance of, the reduction of the unpaid? Do we end up looking good on those investments because the state threw in a few buckets of money?
Regretfully, what the state did in terms of those, and I believe they took $1 billion out of the general fund 3, 4, 5 years ago, doesn't affect the issue here on police and fire. It's a separate fund, a separate
Yeah,
line.
you're right.
So we don't really get the benefit of that going forward. It turns out that that investment did very well for the state as well when they made that additional deposit because of the run-up in the stock market.
Anything else, Fred?
Not informed enough to ask.
Go ahead, sir.
From a technical matter, in terms of how we would actually borrow the money, we use what is called a certificate of participation mechanism, or something called a COP, COP. And what we would essentially do is borrow the money and collateralize our borrowing with certain municipal property. That property would be equal to or greater than the value that we're actually borrowing at. So the amount of borrowing, if it grows to 68 million, we would have put up properties more than that. During that period of time, the municipality may not sell the property that it pledges to the bondholders, and that we involve a trustee and then lease back. This is something we have done several times at the municipality, and it's a fairly common procedure not only here, but also across the country.
Okay. Forrest and then Pete.
So with that, and you're probably not the right person to
You do?
answer this, but if we're going to, I have two questions. First, how novel is this approach? I mean, is this something that's done by a lot of cities all the time, or is this something I've never heard of this procedure before, and I'm worried that some of my constituents might be freaked out by the idea that we're basically, leasing our own buildings or whatever it is.
Can we
My
do all
sec-
of Muldoon? Sorry, go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah, I'll put high value buildings on. The second question, actually kind of related to Dick's humorous remark, is there are certain how do you anticipate which buildings we're going to use or not use? I mean, for example, our HHS buildings we're going to knock down. I'm assuming that's not going to be one of the ones that's put up in this way. So how do we determine which of these buildings or properties, like the school bus barns now we want to move, that kind of thing. How do you figure out which buildings?
Let me answer the second question first. I guess the first question first. It's a fairly common procedure. Both we demonstrated that the municipality's done it back in '86. That was the same structure, the suspension of lease back. Across the country, we do thousands of these a year. So it's a very common procedure to enable to borrow based upon the assets. A lease and lease back structure enables many of these transactions to be tax exempt. This one's going to be taxable, but there's comparable transactions. I can certainly get you Dunbar a list of other transactions.
Second to last page.
Thanks.
Right. So there's a number of different.
I wasn't reading ahead. I was just going through the presentation.
We're glad we anticipated your question.
Yeah.
In terms of identifying the building, we will go over to the municipality and figure out which event, but there would be buildings that would not be scheduled, obviously, for demolition. Places like Egan Center, places like Sullivan Arena.
Well, but
McDonald's Center.
those aren't currently scheduled for demolition, but
Nor are they making much revenue.
yeah.
Nor are they making much revenue. So, but these are assets that have a value and going forward.
Do they have to be MOA, or do they be some of the enterprises we've owned?
For example.
I know Merrill Field, for example. I want to throw some out because some people will think I'm actually proposing it, but Merrill Field or the port or something like
Kinnick
that.
Arm Crossing?
What's that? Yeah. Does it have to be like a MOA sort of proper building?
It's, I mean, you have an accounting issue potentially, but it would be, municipality owns all of its assets, so,
Right.
It's an
The golf
accounting
course.
question, any one of the municipalities, probably not a golf course, would not necessarily appropriate, it's usually as physical, it really would have to have
An improvement.
a building as opposed to just.
Something has value. By itself.
It would be, actually should be an asset that would specifically have a value. And in essence, the market somewhat dictates it, but you want to, at least from the appreciable future, I mean, the last one was Sullivan, so it's a kind of what you look at and think is a facility that's going to be there a long time. So for example, if you actually owned this building, this would be one of them, because you've been here a long time.
If we owned it, we'd sell it.
You bought it many times. You actually bought it a number of times.
Terrible
That's
lease.
right, yes.
Is there a requirement, ma'am, to maintain the building at a certain level? Is there federal requirements involved in maintaining the building?
Well, it's written in that you'll keep it up and you'll maintain it, but it's not as if, quite frankly, the buyers of these COPs are not particularly expecting they're gonna get the building. I mean, they really.
I know, but I just wanna make sure there's no
Yes.
federal requirements on the
No.
amount of maintenance.
No, no specific requirements, no.
You know, some of our buildings need repair now and then. Pete?
Well, we've actually, my question has sort of come up. I just would like to suggest that we do put up the Sullivan Arena. I think that's a really good idea.
If they want to foreclose that.
If I could pronounce the name of that new park we've got in Muldoon, that might be a good one.
Johnston Mobile
Yeah,
Park.
you got it. He'll give you the spelling on it. Anyway, only kidding. Any other questions before they continue? Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I know there was a question last week about whether there was advantages of doing one large financing with many multiple financings. The advantage of a single financing obviously is that we eliminate or reduce the financing costs in terms of going forward. We also don't increase the interest rate risk. Interest rates are low today. If we did a number of financings over a number of years, interest rates could go up, and that would obviously affect the economics of the transaction.
Okay.
And although we're generally in favor of additional financing costs, in this case, we're going to recommend retirement. I know the question came up earlier about how the funds are going to be invested. On page 9 and page 10, we talk about where the funds are currently invested by the system. The system, as I said, has a separate retirement board and has its own guidelines separate from the municipality. The makeup of the system is it's a 9-member board with 3 municipal representatives, 3 police representatives, and 3 fire representatives. On page 10, in addition to the allocation, we've shown the recent returns to date. As you can see, from the last year, they've made almost 12%, 3-year percent, 6, and over 5 years, a little bit more than 9.
Good. Anything else? Okay. Question from assembly members. Fred, anything?
No, it just really needs to be underscored that this is not an uncommon process. It's not novel, it's not, managing the risk of this is very bright people have been doing it for a long time.
John?
Just to keep it simple terms, we buy a house and you get a 15-year, you pay a whole lot more up front, but ultimately you paid a lot less than your 30-year. So to me, we're switching over to a 30-year mortgage instead of a 15. So we will ultimately spend more. And you're saying less, I'm not seeing it, because you're pretending I'm getting a 15-year mortgage but paying for 30 years.
We went back
Am I
and
wrong
forth.
on this?
Well, we went back and forth as to what the proper assumptions were to present to you. On the one hand, we thought about amortizing the comps over a 10-year period because that was the remaining 15-year period from 5 years ago, and showing up that way. Even that way, you save money, a significant amount of money. But your obligation to pay for the fund lasts until 2033. So even if we did it over 10 years, you would still have additional obligations that you owe to the fund until the fund's fully invested in 2033. So that's why we went it out to 33. If you would prefer, we can run it back 10 years. The annual debt service goes up a little bit. In fact, it goes from 6.4 to 6.7. But you're correct that we would be paying, no, it goes from 6.4 that we're showing here to 7.7. So it goes up another $1 million, but we would still be saving money over the 10.3 million, and yes, we would be paying it off over a shorter period of time. So if you prefer that we would sell it over 10 years, we certainly can do that. The economics of the transaction stay the same, that in each year, we would be saving money versus what you would be paying over the 10.3.
Well, that's not, I mean, 15 or whatever for the cops is fine. But
Okay.
when you compare it to what we're doing now, we won't be paying to 2033. We'll be done in 6.5 years. We'll be at 90%. We're good. But you show it as going all the way through 2033. And when I pay off my house after 15 years, I'm done. I don't
Correct.
keep paying.
But the difference between your house is, unless you borrow at a variable rate, when you borrow at a fixed rate on your house, you know what the payments are going to be. The nature of this process is the payments keep changing because the actuarial rate keeps changing based upon the useful lives of the participants as well as the investment income. So we assume there that we would continue paying 10.3. That's a conservative assumption.
Well, if in 7 years we would have paid in $73 million and we only owe 68, to then assume that it's conservative, that we would pay for another 9 years, you're way
Well-
overshooting. I mean, this puts, what you're saying here is we'll put 165 million in, but we only owe 68. Right?
No.
Is that what you're saying? We're 68 million short for
You
being
would
90%
do 75 million,
funded.
you would do 68 million short, yes. And so you're putting.
You're
60
telling us we potentially would be putting in 165. I mean, what assumptions would make this, what assumptions would make us have to pay $10.3 million after the point we're 90% funded?
If the interest rate on your assets, if your performance of the fund goes down, and the actuaries change the actuarial rate down, that will increase the amount you owe.
How much down? I mean, that means we had negative.
We don't know what the performance is, and we wanted to show you conservative numbers, so.
Did we use the same assumptions here for the cops?
The cops are fixed, so the cops don't, the rate on the cops, once you put the number in on the cops, when we borrow the money, that rate is fixed. The problem is the other side of the column, that number would constantly change. We know what it is today based on the assumptions, but as the system continues to move, that number can change. But you're correct, that number, we tried to take a conservative number of how much you would have to fund over time. And that number, hopefully, isn't too much money, and you would have to actually pay less. But if you wanted to draw a line, for example, in 2025, when we proposing to amortize this, or actually it's not 2027, we could cut the line off there and you would calculate the savings there. Even if we amortize the comps over that period of time, we would still be saving the municipality dollars each year.
Anything else? I got other people, John.
No, go ahead. Thanks.
Pete?
Doing math in my head.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and what I think we all have to keep in mind is if we put $68 million or whatever it is into the market, there is the potential for a correction. There's always a potential for a correction. We don't know what's gonna happen today or next Monday or whatever with stocks. And so, there could be a 20% correction. We have to, that's the risk. You never know. Typically, this type of investment has worked out over the long period of time, but we have to make the decision if we think it's worth the risk. Thank you.
Chris and then Eric.
Yeah, that's perfect lead into my question. So previously I'd asked a question about the potential of restricting the funding as a donor, as an investor, and there are two restrictions that I would like to hear if we can or cannot do. And one is, can these funds be tied to low-risk pools as opposed to being thrown into the casino of the stock market so that they generate revenues over time, but limit the risk of this amount that we're investing? And then the second one is, can we restrict that there be no payouts from this fund, like the settlement that happened after the 1986 one that caused the problem that we're in, where we paid $100,000 for every member, that this gets paid back before any kind of payout might be made, other than the reasonable and ongoing payouts that go to the beneficiaries of the program. You know what I mean? Am I communicating?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
The administration of the fund is a function of the system.
Right?
And that's something that the municipal assembly passed in compliance. So there's an ordinance already in place which delegates the administration of the funds to the system. We certainly can convey your wishes over to the system and see whether they're willing to accommodate that, but that's not something as a municipality that we're entitled to do because the system is managing the funds.
So effectively, we could make this payment, could be a big pile of money in the account, and they could decide again, we have too much money, we should pay each other out. And then we would still be on the hook for this debt? Is that what I'm hearing?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
I'll speak as a trustee. I'm one of the trustees.
Right.
The system currently allows for additional payouts to beneficiaries after the fund gets to 116%
Right.
of being fully funded.
Right.
This ordinance or this proposal would not change that. And I don't believe the system would support a change to that 116% threshold at this time. So it would require, that would require reconstituting the settlement that was struck in 2000 or 2001. And I'm not even sure the system board could make that change on its own. There would have to be some process that would involve the beneficiaries themselves. And I'm not aware of what that process would look like or how that would go. So at this point, we would not recommend tying a change in the over 116% threshold. Now, should be noted that the system, or a portion of the system, got above 116% at least once since the settlement was struck. And the board, at that point, did not make a payout. They were concerned that that 116% level was not sustainable, and that therefore they did not recommend using the latitude that the settlement language provided in terms of making a supplemental payout. So I think the board has demonstrated that it is capable of taking into account a larger and longer term view rather than just immediately taking advantage of a temporary surplus. So that's I think, and Paul may have a different comment on that. Paul is a fire beneficiary, a longtime trustee for 20 years, almost 20 years, right?
I think Michael's history is fairly accurate.
Right, so at one point then, the group did opt to pay themselves a big chunk of money, and at one point they didn't, and so we have both scenarios in the history of the organization.
The big payout back in 2000 should not be compared. That was done, that was the direct outcome of the settlement itself. That was not a board choice that was made. So the board has never paid a supplemental benefit since the system was established. I think that's correct, right, Paul? So the only time the system has been over 116%, which was only a portion of the system and only for 1 year, it did not take advantage of that opportunity to create a supplemental benefit. So it was the municipality that agreed to the large payout during the settlement process. That was a process of an assembly decision at that time.
Anything else, Chris?
It makes me skeptical.
Before we go to Eric, I got a question for Lance, since you're in the room, Lance. When I look at page 5, it says the effect of this will be zero payment going out in 2018 of $10 million. So the budget looks good, but then the next year we have to pay on debt service on COP $6.4 million. So for 2018, our budget's going to be plump with because we don't have to pay the $10 million, but the next year, then it can continue back at $6.4 million. Is that the understanding on the city's budget as you guys put it together? Okay.
It's still lower than 10.3.
Yeah, but still, I want them to understand what we're doing because the public's going to look at that and wonder, is there a shell game going on with the budget? Eric?
Two quick questions for the Abbott and Falsey team. Given that, why even get close to the 116, right? Doesn't anything why not keep paying on an amount that is well below 116 so you avoid the risk you'll ever get to it?
And that is why, at this point, our tentative plan is not to
90 instead of 100?
Right, and so that it is less likely that we get to 160.
And then the flip side.
And I should say, the reason that the settlement, almost 20 years ago, set the threshold at 116 was to protect the municipality, so that if the system's at 110, 111, 19, 109, something like that, that it is not available for a supplemental benefit, as it had been in previous years prior to the settlement, so that then that money can ride, and that to the degree that there is market underperformance after that, the city is somewhat protected about getting below 100% again. So that was one of the key protections the city negotiated for prior to the settlement, which cashed out both the muni and the beneficiaries.
And then the flip side, if this is such a good idea, why not do it big time? That is, why not borrow 200 million from these nice people and get instead, that's roughly tripling it, and so our savings of 4 million, we'd have 12 million a year, and I think that's 60 cops for 10 years. Why not play the market big time?
Well, the
We could.
Yeah.
But the problem is that if we deposited all that money into the fund, then the fund would be overfunded.
No, different fund. Now you put it into our permanent fund, in effect. You put it into ours that spits out the same kind of revenue, but goes into our general fund. And we do the same thing you're doing, except the savings now come into the general fund, and then we pay out of the general fund your interest fee, and we pocket the difference.
So the trust fund would probably not be a great place to do that. The municipal trust fund, it has a payout at only 4.25%, I think.
4.25.
So there's not a lot of benefit. The difference between the interest paid and the municipal revenue gleaned would not be very high, and probably would not offset the risk that we've been talking about. We believe, in this case, with a closed system that has a finite end life, and for whatever reason, a municipal obligation that was not expected 20 years ago when the structure was set up, that this is a relatively unusual case where this kind of investment/debt instrument makes sense.
Well, wait a minute. If we can make this kind of money, and I understand the artificial, if you will, limitations on what we pay out on the trust fund, but if we can make this from this pot of money, and it's an appropriate way to solve a debt we have, why isn't it an appropriate way to make even more to do things we want to do?
That is simply a risk choice. I mean, there are lots of people around the world that make their living investing, and a lot of them are doing it with leverage, borrowing the money that they're investing. So it is a way to go. It is an unusual municipal revenue source, but for an operating budget. But maybe there's examples of it out there. I'm not aware of them off the top of my head, and I don't think we'd recommend that the risk would be appropriate. But it certainly is in play. I don't know to what extent we have access to different financing tools and things like that. That's a question for Steve and Cynthia. But if the Assembly wanted to examine that, I don't know, sometime after November 1st, I think that'd be a great idea.
He's like a gentleman's got his walking papers.
Does it?
We'll let the record reflect too. We've been joined 20 minutes ago by Tim Steele and Eamon Dubowski. Thanks for being here.
I think Bill Steele would be great, or Bill Paulson would be an excellent resource for the Assembly.
I believe that's right.
We'll see. Other questions from Assembly members? Any questions? Would you guys let us know what your position is once you have your meeting?
Looks like John has.
Would appreciate
Another
it.
bite at the apple.
They said they would.
Go ahead, John.
They said they'd do more math for us. So, again, my understanding was, what we saw 2 weeks ago, that after 6 or 7 years at $10.3 million, we're done, and we might have to pay.
It was a 15-year agreement 5 years ago, so it's after 10 years.
But then we're way overfunded then. Okay, well, let's say it's 10 years. So, and then we're done. We might have to do a little bit here or there, but you've assumed that there was crisis in the market.
More tweets out of the White
We-
House.
We can make the assumption that you're done, and we can run the math that way.
Okay, well then I'll just assume that. So we're done after 10 years. We've totally done it.
Right.
We might have a little
Might have
more,
stuff-
but it'd be $1 million here, 500,000 here or there after 10 years. But if you do the assumption you did here, that, the market tanked and we have to keep pumping in 10.3 million because we're not making any earnings on the money we have in there. So we gotta keep pumping money in. The market totally fell apart. Well, equivalently on those years, I mean, this is what we're paying on the cops, but we may have to pay more than that. If the market tanks, then the earnings on the fund don't cover our liabilities.
But that would be reflected in the later years that you're seeing. Historically, if you have a bad year in the fund, the amount that you owe as to do with that bad year is amortized over the life of the fund. So whatever obligations you have over the fund are not due today, they're obligated over the life of the fund, which here is 2033. So whatever idiosyncrasies or hiccups that we have in terms of amortization are never due in that year. They're amortized over the remaining life of the fund, which in this case is 2033. You're correct that as we get shorter and shorter, closer and closer to 2033, any things that happen bad, the ramifications of that are larger because we don't have as long a time to amortize those issues. But, Mr. President, we can run whatever scenario you would like in terms of what happens after 10 years from now. We know that according to the current Milliman report, at least the most recent one, that they had projected that we would owe 10.3 over a 15-year period, which began 5 years ago. So that's why we originally assumed that we would have a 10.3 period of payments over the next 10 years, remaining 10 years. And then the question of what happens after that, we don't know, and so we just assumed that that would continue. But we can certainly run the numbers otherwise.
That's what they-
I can just X amount, I think I'm
The
good.
fact that they just stopped it after 15 years doesn't necessarily mean that when you get to the end of that 15-year period, it's going to go to zero. I think that's what we're
No,
trying to
no, I
say.
understand that, but it might not be zero because bad things happen.
Right.
But did we assume bad things here? Because bad things could happen in that 6.4 million we're paying back the cops.
Right. Well, that's
But
a
there-
fixed
there
rate.
may not
That's
be
not,
enough.
that, well,
Cops don't change.
the 6.4
The cops
million.
won't, but our liability could. So this shows our complete liability. This shows only our liability for the cops.
That's correct.
But the liability for the fund in general could be higher than 6.4.
It could be, or it could be less.
So I'd want to see a liability for the fund column using the same assumptions, horrible crisis, that we did in this one, the first column.
We would have to get in touch with Milliman, but we can certainly prepare an analysis that shows that.
Okay, when do we vote on this? Tuesday?
Tuesday.
Okay, got plenty of time.
Thank you, John. I've got another person. Eric?
So is this similar to a relative of what the legislature floated with pension obligation bonds? Or I guess the governor floated and the
Governor floated, I
legislature
think.
said no. Is it the same basic device?
To be accurate, Mr. Croft, the legislature never said no,
Okay.
so the governor did float it. It is a similar device in that you're borrowing money over a period of time to help fund an unfunded liability.
Right.
I will point out gratuitously that had the governor continued with that plan, they would have saved over $1 million over the last year. But anyway, having said that, it's a similar idea in terms of how we would be borrowing money in advance of our obligations and being able to repay it in a less manner. The PERS and TERS funds are much differently operated than the police and fire, and so there are different idiosyncrasies there. But it is a similar concept.
Okay, thanks.
I would add to that one additional.
Mr.
consideration,
Falsey?
which is These are closed systems. So the downside risk of doing it at the state level was that you're gonna cause every year to be more expensive, sort of in perpetuity. The downside risk here is, if you think this is not gonna work out, this is ultimately gonna cost us more, it will change the timeline so that it costs us more, but in little increments over a longer time. So even if there's not a net savings, there's still a liquidity benefit to do this now.
Other questions from Assembly members? Yes, ma'am.
In case you actually take this home and really read it
Yeah.
really carefully, I want to make the point that you're not actually selling the assets and then buying them back. The word sell is in there, and that was in word, you'd be leasing them out, let's say, for 20 years and then leasing them back for 15. So you would never actually lose title. No matter what happens, even if you stop paying the COPs, you never actually lose the asset. You may lose possession of the asset, but you're not actually selling the assets. You're leasing them out and leasing them back. So you always will own the asset. You just may lose possession if you stopped paying the COPs. You lose possession of the asset for that period of time, but you would never actually lose the asset. There's not a mortgage on the asset.
Pete,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
you want to get rid of Sullivan? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's, I think it's a liability. There's a couple of reasons for doing this. We have to fund the police and fire retirement liability, but also from what I see looking at this frees up $10.3 million for the 2018 budget.
Yes, sir, it does.
And so that's $10.3 million that we don't have to cut. That's $10.3 million in property taxes that we don't have to raise. And so those are the couple reasons that we're actually doing this the way I look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This meeting's over with. The next one starts in 10 minutes.